Who gets all the hype? It's Rolex, it's Tudor, it's AP, it's Omega. Go to any YouTube channel or any watch-related site, and there's a very small number of brands that get a vast majority of the attention. But there are some good brands out there that are rarely featured, and that's about to change. 10 brands that don't get talked about enough. 10 brands that I think you really should spend just a little bit more of your time paying attention to because they've got something cool and possibly you missed it. Let's dive in. Certina doesn't get mentioned often. When you're looking for a give or take to $1,000, $2,000 diver watch, most people are likely to suggest a Seiko, maybe a Citizen or a Christopher Ward or a Hamilton. But consider these three watches. There's the DS Action Diver. You get a Tier 2 Powermatic 80 movement, so not just the entry Powermatic 80. You get 300 meters of water resistance, you get a steel bracelet with a diver's extension, and a design that's a little bit basic, but that's a good thing. It's simple, uncomplicated, and good looking. If you throw in a little bit more cash, you can get a very respectable GMT version. If you want something with a little bit more of a vintage or retro vibe, the PH200M is also a cool aesthetic. The bezel is super Blancpain 50 fathoms-ish, or Seiko SNZH, with, the bulbous appearance and makes for something a bit more distinctive. And finally, there's the PH1000M, which does a bit of what the Willard does for Seiko and the Frogman does for Hamilton. It's a more distinctive, more pro-looking diver in a still reasonable wearable size. Certina aren't perfect. I think they sometimes on the dressier options lean more on the bland side. They are sometimes into that minimalist Daniel Wellington kind of aesthetic, but the divers and a couple of their chronos are really worth a look. Heuer are a relatively old British watch brand. They've been going through a bit of a revival for the past couple of years, and I think it really kicked off with the limited edition jump hour model they released a couple of years back, which was more or less instantly sold out. Heuer aren't a huge brand. They don't have a catalog with the overwhelming depth of Omega, but what they have stands out for a couple of reasons. First of all, as you probably do know, if you want to watch from a semi-independent under $3,000, you throw a rock at them, chances are you're going to hit a Solita movement. Usually it's a variant of the SW200 or an SW300, but not Heuer. They use Le Juperet and ETA. And those are good movements, but most of all, they're just different. On top of that, Heuer are not afraid to use manual wide movements, which I personally think is charming. Secondly, from a build quality perspective, these watches are impeccably finished. Heuer haven't gone down the route of the Solita skin diver. Their watches are dressier, and as a result, they need to look the part, and the fit, the solidity, and the shine of the cases is up to an incredibly high standard. I recently had hands-on with the Brunswick model, and the movement isn't on par with the Tudor Metas, but when we look at the finishing of the case and bracelet, you've got a pretty good watch there. Thirdly, it's the design. There's the Redcliffe model, which is their sports watch. It's their alternative to a Nomus Club Sport or an Aquaterra or Longines Conquest. From this kind of watch, you want simplicity, you want elegance. You want a great dial in multiple colors and a good-looking tapering bracelet. Question is, this or Tag Heuer Carrera? I'm going for this. In the Brunswick, you've got a not quite Panerai type dress watch. It's got a lot of the design characteristics that you recognize from a Panerai Luminor, and it's still much cheaper than the Panerai. These watches are thin, they're easily wearable, and just generally worth a look. Believe it or not, Tag Heuer doesn't get mentioned that much. That's going to sound wrong to you, especially when I tell you that they sell somewhere around 500,000 watches a year. That's objectively a lot, but they're still a consumer brand and not a huge enthusiast brand. Sure, there are for sure Tag Heuer forums and fans out there, and they are dedicated to them, but the broad opinions of them are either that they are overpriced or they are more watches and they're not particularly good. But I realized something the other day. Do you know how Tudor sets up their line of watches? Well, it's easy. They have their dress watches and their sports watches. The sport watches are the divers, the serious divers, and the chronographs. Rolex is the same. They've got classic and professional, with watches falling into those different categories. Now, Tag have all those kinds of models as well, but their lineup is actually set up a little bit differently. Tag has got consumer watches, they've got baller watches, and they've got enthusiast watches. So the consumer is the bog standard quartz Formula One races, the Link bracelet chronos, which I used to own one of many years ago. Those kind of watches. They're not bad, but they are not the ones that are squarely targeted at enthusiasts. They are, on the other hand, squarely targeted at non-enthusiasts. The baller watches are the ceramic tourbillon Monacos, and the enthusiast watches are the Octavias and the Carrera glass boxes. When you look at Tag through that lens, so not dress, sport, tool, or chrono, but consumer, baller, enthusiast, I'd say, you're missing out if you're not paying attention to the enthusiast watches. TAG have consistently been putting out smartly designed, well-built and excellently spec'd enthusiast-orientated watches for a while now, and they deserve more attention. They're still on the expensive side, but they simply are that good. And yes, Hodinkee covers them, but they were owned by LVMH, so, that was a given. The snobbery and the disdain for TAG Heuer because of the transgressions of the past should really be put to bed, in my opinion. Those watches are cool and they're worth a look. Another brand that doesn't get enough attention is Seiko. I know this is going to be a little bit counterintuitive to you because Seiko are a massive brand that move huge volumes. But whenever Seiko get brought up, a lot of the criticism boils down to sometimes pedantic perspectives on movement accuracy and regulation and premium pricing. That and bracelets. The first is not entirely unfair, and the latter is, something they do need to work on. As for premium pricing, what's new? All brands do this, but the reality is how many brands offer you a $500 option, an upgrade of the same or a similar watch for $2,000, and on top of that, you might often even get a premium option for somewhere around $3,000 or $4,000. SLA 067 versus a Tudor black bay ceramic. I'm going 067. SPB 143 versus a Christopher Ward. I'm going SPB 143. It's way better looking. It's a superior designer. It's much more distinctive. If you want a beta, you have any number of Seikos to choose from, and they take a licking and keep on ticking, even to this day. There's this perspective that the AK-47 is this most widely used machine gun in the world because of its reliability. There's also the same perspective of the Toyota Hilux, which was this indestructible car you could find anywhere in the world. My guess is if there's a watch that has that kind of indestructible nature, it's going to be a Seiko. There's not the same romance to Seiko's marketing as there is to Tudor or Rolex, or even Hamilton, but they need to be paid more attention to. Glashütte are not an unknown brand. Enthusiasts know them and they are definitely lovers of the brand. Swatch, of course, are not great at exposing the brand to the wider world, but they really, really should. Nomos often gets this value moniker for delivering relatively affordable mid-range watches that are fully in-house. Glashütte are in a totally different price range. They're often more expensive than Rolex, but they are cheaper than Lange, Patek and Blancpain. But they're also massively underappreciated, I think. There's the CQ in the entry version and there's the Pano version. The entry is what I consider to be one of the absolute best skin divers out there. The finishing is ahead of Rolex. The dial design is better than that of the Blancpain bathyscaphe. It's more refined than an SJE 093 and it's got a movement inside that really isn't a slouch. If you go for the larger Pano version, you're getting a full display caseback with swan neck regulator, which puts any display caseback Rolex to shame. Not that there are that many display caseback Rolexes, but there are a couple. You've got the Panamatic Luna, which in my opinion is aesthetically superior to the Lange 1. It's got more balance, it's more legible, and it's just a tad more modern, and it costs a fraction of the price. On top of that, you've got some really distinctive dressier offerings in the 60s and 70s models that are vastly more exciting than the much more plain Jaeger-LeCoultre Ultra Master Ultra Thins, and they even give Grand Seiko a run for their money in terms of interesting and elaborate dials. Alpina, if you didn't know, are owned by Citizen. Not every brand is owned by Richemont, LVMH or Swatch. The Japanese conglomerates also play that game. Alpina want a decent alternative to a Longines Legend diver? They've got you covered with a C-Strong with a dependable Solita movement on the inside. You want a world timer that doesn't look like crap and won't cost you an arm and a leg? The Star Timer is a decent choice. It's quartz, but that's not always a bad thing. And, my favorites are the C-Strong divers in various versions. There isn't your regular oyster case knockoff or homage or inspiration. It's got a bit of that Panerai vibe going on, mixed in with some of the aggression of a Hublot Big Bang or a Bell & Ross, but in a good way. They come in at under $3,000 for a 300-meter water resistance integrated bracelet dive watch, which incidentally wears a lot better than a Zenith Defy Extreme, which costs more than double. They've got some originality in their designs, they stand out and the watches are solid. By the way, if you've made it this far and you feel like the video warrants it, give it a like, and if you're new to the channel, click that subscribe button. It really helps out the channel. Thanks a ton. If you know Marathon, you know why I'm putting them on the list. A lot of brands try to leverage some level of military vibe for some of their watches. Panerai have watches connected to different special forces teams. The Marine Nationale of France are prominent with Yema and even with Tudor. Rolex doesn't advertise it that much, but there are SAS Rolexes out there. When the King of Denmark was coronated, he was wearing an Omega Seamaster 300M from his time in the service as a Danish Navy SEAL. None of these brands, though, come close to Marathon, at least not to me. Everything about their brand seems to scream mil spec. From the Canadian GSAR to the Marine Corps, it's really a thing for them. And next to maybe G-Shock, they come across as very true to that mil spec kind of mindset. You might not always get a mechanical movement, but that's because these watches have been inspired to work as practical watches. And sometimes quartz is just better. For these watches, in their intended context, they are not compromises when quartz come into play, but rather, they're logical solutions to the problems that they are built to solve. We're living in a time where money is being spent on reviving a lot of older brands. Yema's having a resurgence, Vulcane is trying to get itself back on the map, and Nivada are definitely in the running. As an enthusiast, again, you likely know about them, but if you're new to the hobby, odds are you haven't come across them, which is a shame. They have their bog standard and to me not particularly interesting integrated Nautilus Royal Oak engineer lookalike for a lower price. That's not what gets me excited, but I don't hold it against them. Having stuff on the shelf that sells to the masses is important. For me though, it's the Chronomasters, these vintage retro 60s and 70s-ish chronographs. They're the ones that give me a universal Genève vibe. Nivada does none of that Rolex Daytona Zenith Chronomaster pandering to the middle of the road. It's unashamed retro, and I dig them. You also have different iterations of the Antarctics, including the Super Antarctic, which to me is a visually much more appealing version of a Hamilton khaki. That might be because I'm so used to the Hamilton, but I like it, and that's from someone that hasn't ever really gelled with a Ranger or an Explorer design. Finally, they also have the Depth Masters, which have 2.0 cases, just like Heuers or Panerai or Alpina, and to some extent like the 70s Chronos from Glashütte or Original. There's just more character here. The movements are mostly Solprod, which are essentially ETA, I think 2824 derivatives. They're solid, they're dependable, they're not exciting or high-end, but at this price, it's not off. Last brand. It's a brand that supplies movements to Studio Underdog, or at least they did. I think they still do. No, maybe not. Never mind. It's the Chinese brand Seagull. For a lot of people, Chinese watches equate with flat-out fakes or homage and clomage replicas, but Seagull aren't just that. The watch from them that most people recognize is the Seagull 1963. Bit of a tangent, but one of the things I really look for in watches and brands is that they have focus, like Studio Underdog. Brands that do one or two things really well and just do that. Chinese brands, more often than not, are a little bit more all over the place. I sometimes get the feeling that they have no product manager managing the entire catalog, and ensuring that the catalog has a cohesive design language is just not important to them. This is, as far as I'm concerned, also the case with Seagull, but they've been around since the 1950s, and there's some good stuff in there. And as far as I can tell, most complaints about quality are mainly 2 or 3 or more years ago. So in this broad catalog of they've got a lot of stuff and some of it is a little bit derivative, they do have some gems that I really think are worth looking at. 10 brands. Some of them you knew, some of them you didn't. What they have in common though is that they're a little bit underrated and underrepresented in the cacophony of Rolex, Tudor and Omega releases. They're just kind of there, which is a shame because they have something in their catalogs that's worth taking a look at. I'm not saying you should buy. That's always your decision and up to your taste, but it wouldn't hurt to have a look. Now it's your turn. What other brands do you feel don't get enough love and attention? Let me know in the comments. As always, like, subscribe. Cheers.